This story ends in a freezer. But let me tell you how it started. Three men were chained to the floor of a walk-in freezer, stripped of their coats, lying on bare concrete. Their breath turned into thick white clouds that disappeared into the dark. Their fingers had gone numb an hour ago. Now they couldn't feel their arms. One of them tried to scream, but the cold had already reached his throat, and all that came out was a hollow, broken whisper. They weren't in a dungeon. They weren't in a warehouse on the wrong side of town. They were in the back of a restaurant where, 40 feet away, men in expensive suits were eating dinner, talking quietly and smoking cigars. Nobody came to help them. Nobody was going to. 72 hours earlier, these three men had been laughing in a warm apartment, splitting millions of dollars in stolen cash across a kitchen table. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had just pulled off the smartest heist of their lives. They had made one mistake. They stole from Tony Accardo. To everyone on his street in the Chicago suburbs, Tony Accardo was just a quiet old man. He woke up early. He tended his garden. He clipped the hedges with careful, methodical hands. He paid his taxes on time, kept to himself, and smiled warmly at the neighbors when they walked their dogs past his gate. He had a beautiful wife, a big house, and grandchildren who visited on Sundays. He looked like someone's grandfather. He was not someone's grandfather. Tony Accardo was the boss of the Chicago outfit, the most powerful mafia organization in the United States. For 30 years, he had controlled the city's illegal casinos, the loan sharks, and a network of corrupt judges and police commanders who kept the whole machine running quietly in the dark. Every rival who had ever tried to challenge him was gone. He had never spent a single night in a prison cell. Other mob bosses were loud. They ended up on the front pages of newspapers. Accardo was invisible, and that invisibility was the most dangerous thing about him. But there was something else the three thieves should have known, something every serious criminal in Chicago understood as basic survival knowledge, the kind of thing you learned fast or didn't get the chance to learn at all. Before Tony Accardo became the quiet man in the garden, he was something else entirely. He was Joe Batters. It was the 1920s. Tony Accardo was young, massive, and completely silent. The kind of man who could fill a doorway and say nothing and still make you want to leave the room. Al Capone, the most feared gangster in American history, kept him close, not as a driver, not as a messenger, as his personal enforcer, his last resort. The man you sent when you didn't want noise, you wanted results. The story that defined Tony Accardo forever happened at a dinner party. Capone had learned that three of his most trusted captains were secretly planning to betray him. A different boss might have had them shot in the street. Capone was more theatrical. He invited them to a lavish feast, an enormous table covered in food and wine, candles, music, laughter. The three men arrived, relaxed into their chairs, and believed they were safe. They were at the table for 2 hours before anything changed. Then the kitchen doors opened. Tony Accardo walked out slowly, without a word. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a wooden baseball bat, dark and heavy, gripped in both hands. What happened next was witnessed by every man in that room. Accardo moved down the table with the calm, methodical efficiency of someone completing a routine task. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. One by one, he beat all three men to death where they sat, shattering bones, silencing screams, until the room went completely quiet. Al Capone looked at the wreckage, drew on his cigar, and said, "This kid is a real Joe Batters." The name stayed with Accardo for the rest of his life. a quiet warning printed in the memory of every person who ever sat across a table from him. In January 1957, 30 years after that dinner party, 3 men decided to rob him anyway. They were insiders. That was the only reason they even knew the vault existed. All 3 had worked inside outfit operations long enough to know the schedules, the guard rotations, the blind spots in the security system. On a freezing night in January, they moved quickly and quietly, past the alarms, through the side entrance, straight to the hidden concrete vault buried inside one of Accardo's properties. They smashed it open. Inside, they found exactly what they came for: bags of cash, millions of dollars in untraceable bills accumulated over decades of criminal revenue. But they also found something they hadn't expected: notebooks. Private, handwritten notebooks. Inside those pages were names, politicians, judges, police commanders, business owners, payments made, favors owed, compromises recorded in Accardo's own handwriting, the entire skeleton of his empire, written down in ink. They took everything. Back at the safe house, one of them was already on the phone before they finished unloading the bags, calling a contact about a car he wanted to buy. Another cracked open a bottle of whiskey and started peeling cash from a stack like it was nothing. They spread the money across the kitchen table, the couch, the floor, every flat surface in the apartment covered in bills. They were loud. They were celebrating. They felt, in that moment, completely untouchable. Outside, the snow had buried their tire tracks. They thought that meant they were invisible. It didn't. Tony Accardo's network, a web of informants and loyal eyes spread across every neighborhood in Chicago, had already begun moving before the thieves even reached the safe house. By morning, the address was known. By the following evening, a plan had been approved. Not a loud plan. A quiet one. Joe Batters didn't make noise. He made arrangements. A messenger arrived at the safe house door the next afternoon. He was calm, well-dressed. He spoke in a low, even voice, the way men speak when they represent someone so powerful that raising their voice would be unnecessary and slightly embarrassing. The message was simple. The boss knew about the money. He wasn't asking for it back. Cash could be replaced. But the notebooks were a different problem. Those pages, in the wrong hands, could bring down judges, destroy alliances, and expose 50 years of careful, invisible work. The boss wanted the notebooks returned. That was the only thing he cared about. If the 3 men brought the notebooks to a private meeting that night, they would be allowed to keep a portion of the cash and leave Chicago. No retaliation, no pursuit, a clean exit. If they refused, the conversation would become much more complicated. The messenger left without waiting for an answer. The 3 men sat in silence for a long time. One of them said they shouldn't go, that the whole thing was a setup, that no one walked into a room with Tony Accardo's people and walked back out. The second one didn't say anything. He just poured another drink and stared at the table. The third one, after a long pause, said it didn't matter, that there was no version of this where they ran far enough. Accardo's reach wasn't a city, it was a country. This meeting was the only door that even looked like it might lead somewhere other than a ditch on the side of a road. Nobody argued with that. They packed the notebooks. They put on their coats. They drove through the freezing Chicago night, checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds, watching the headlights behind them, trying to read every shadow. They were dangerous men. They had done dangerous things. But their hands were shaking. They parked behind a restaurant on the south side of the city. The lights inside were low. A man at the back door waved them in without a word. They walked through the entrance, the door locked behind them. The dining room was empty and dark except for a single light hanging over a long wooden table. No waiters, no music, no Accardo. They sat down and waited, holding the notebooks, watching the shadows at the edges of the room. Minutes passed. The air felt wrong, too still, too cold, too quiet. One of the men started to stand. The steel kitchen doors exploded open. Heavy men moved through the room with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this before and felt nothing about doing it again. Before the thieves could reach the weapons under their jackets, a chemical spray hit their eyes, burning, blinding, dropping them to the floor instantly, screaming and helpless. The screaming didn't last long. Nobody was going to hear it anyway. The enforcers worked in silence, iron chains around the wrists and ankles, pulled tight. The men were dragged across the floor, through the kitchen, through a heavy insulated door, and into the walk-in freezer. The door sealed shut behind them. The temperature dial on the wall was turned all the way down. In the dark, the cold moved fast. First the skin, then deeper, into the muscles, into the joints, into the chest. One of them was still trying to pull at the chains. Another had stopped moving and was just breathing, loud and ragged, watching his own breath mist in front of his face, feeling it slow down. The man who had said they shouldn't come, the one who had seen this coming, was completely silent. There was nothing left to say. They had walked through the door anyway. The cold didn't care about any of that. Outside the freezer, the restaurant went on. Dishes were cleared. Glasses were refilled. Tony Accardo was at home, in his warm house, several miles away. He had given his instructions. His people were professionals. The three men who thought they had outsmarted Joe Batters spent their final hours on a concrete floor in the dark, listening to their own breathing slow and then stop. They had all the money in the world. It was in an apartment across the city. It didn't help them at all. And the worst part? What happened next was even stranger than the crime itself. When Chicago police finally found the cars, weeks later, abandoned in frozen ditches on the outskirts of the city, what was inside the trunks stopped the investigators cold. The bodies had been frozen solid for so long that normal decomposition hadn't occurred. The coroners couldn't establish a time of death. They couldn't pin down a location. They couldn't build a sequence of events. Every forensic tool they had was useless because the cold had been used as deliberately as a weapon. Not just to kill, to erase. The police knew who had ordered it. Everyone knew. Detectives drove to Tony Accardo's house in the suburbs and knocked on the door. He answered it himself, silver-haired, calm, wearing a cardigan. He invited them in politely and offered them something warm to drink. He sat across from them in his living room and listened to their questions with the patient, slightly confused expression of a man being asked about something entirely outside his world. In a quiet, steady voice, he reminded them that he was retired, that he tended his garden, that he had no knowledge of the events they were describing and wished them the best in their investigation. They left with nothing. No witness ever came forward. No soldier ever talked. Not one person in the entire outfit, at any level, in any neighborhood, said a single word to the police about what had happened that night. The silence was total, and it was not accidental. It was the product of decades of careful, patient discipline. Everyone who worked for Tony Accardo understood one thing above everything else. The only thing more dangerous than what he did to those three men was what he would do to anyone who talked about it. Tony Accardo continued his life exactly as before. The garden, the grandchildren, the Sunday dinners. He died in May 1992 at 86 years old, in a hospital bed, holding his wife's hand. He passed away peacefully, surrounded by family, a free man until the very end, never convicted of a single crime across 50 years of operations. The three men who broke into his vault thought they were stealing from someone who had gone soft. They believed that age had made him slow, that retirement had made him safe, that the distance between his garden and his past was wide enough to protect them. They were wrong about all of it. Some men spend their whole lives building a reputation. Tony Accardo spent his whole life making sure he never had to use it twice. The three thieves made him use it once. Once was enough. Tony Accardo never appeared in a single headline, never sat in a courtroom, never said a word in public about anything he did. The only record he left behind was the silence of the people who knew better than to talk. That silence is still there. And there are more stories inside it. Subscribe to Blood and Ledgers, and we'll keep opening them. We'll see you in the next video.